All right, how's it going, y'all? So Synology has finally unveiled Hyperbackup 4.1, which is the new version of Hyperbackup that has some pretty major improvements in a lot of cases. The single biggest one is something that a lot of people, including myself, have really been waiting on, and that is full bare metal backup of a Synology NAS. Effectively, the same thing you were able to do with Active Backup for Business, where you were using Active Backup for Business to back up another NAS, now is coming to Hyperbackup. It does have some limitations, and I actually broke it. And we're going to talk about that in a minute here because I got a backup to fail and I've yet to get it to start since then, but more on that later. So the biggest improvement on this is by far this bare metal restore, which is something that's been really important. For the longest time, you could back up packages that support it using Hyperbackup, but one, not all packages support it, and two, even the ones that do, don't necessarily fully support it. It's not like if you hyper backup your entire NAS, all of a sudden you get a new NAS, you just throw it in there and just rebuilding it and it's exactly how it was. There was actually a fair amount of configuration and there's some major quirks that could make restoring these things a lot harder than if it was just a true bare metal, exactly how the NAS was before it failed. Then there were apps like Plex that you would lose all of your configuration unless you used Migration Assistant to go from one NAS to the other. Now with this, it promises to fully back everything up, which should be a major selling point really for businesses and even people who have a second NAS who just want to be able to make sure the entire thing's able to be rebuilt easily and not have any issues. A couple of other major improvements that it does have as well is one, a much better UI, I think, where it makes it a lot simpler to navigate. And two, it also has a better improvement. And I did some pretty in-depth testing. Actually, this video is taking so long because I did so much testing on this, backing up with Hyperbackup 4.0, 4.1, and 4.1 bare metal. I've got a post on that. I'm actually going to go through all the data because I did really in-depth testing on all of these things to try to figure out what the improvements are. Because as a lot of people know, Hyperbackup can be quite slow, especially if you've got tons and tons of files. And so I actually did a lot of testing where I generated 1 million files in a directory and going from there trying to see how fast it was in different use cases. And that's actually where I broke the bare metal backup. So we're going to talk about that all in a minute here. So entire system backup is something that a lot of people have been waiting on, including myself. And unfortunately, the documentation is not fully there yet because it doesn't even tell you limitations like, can you back up only BTRFS volumes? I think you actually don't even require to have BTRFS volumes. I've not had time to fully test out all those edge cases, and I've not seen any documentation that says, hey, you can only back up BTRFS volumes. And since it is actually doing the bare metal, I would be surprised if it did require that, though I'm not sure what the requirements are on the destination. I've not been able to see any limitations on that, but at the same time, I've not fully tested every single edge case. It is not available on all models. This is the list right here. And it is looking like it is a feature only for the Plus systems and better, which is unfortunate, but not too surprising given that they kind of try to have some features to pull people up to those higher value systems that make them more money. Because I don't think there's a ton of margin on those J models. I see them as a get your foot in the door, and then you've got all these little, oh, if you get the Plus series, you can get this. You can do Docker, virtual machines, BTRFS, all those little things that kind of bring people up. That's their marketing goal. While obviously I'd love all features to be available on all systems, I don't see this as a major detraction. A lot of those J models have what's called ARM CPUs instead of Intel x86 CPUs. And so there's a fundamental different CPU architecture there. That means that you kind of do have to build a lot of packages completely for ARM or completely for x86. And so it's not just like, oh, they're hiding features behind a paywall. There is some legitimacy there. And it does require having a separate NAS or using the advanced C2 plan to even do this. And I also see a lot of people who have J models don't necessarily have two NASs or don't have a expensive C2 plan. In general, they're probably starting out with a hard drive. And so because of that, I don't see that as a huge distraction because I don't see a lot of J model users going to those things, though they might do that in C2. I will say the limitation requiring it to only go to another Synology NAS or to C2 is quite an annoying one. From really quickly just browsing through the actual file structure, I did a lot of backups of this thing, but when I open up and actually view the files that the .hbk file has for both the bare metal and the standard previous version, we actually see that these things are pretty similar overall structures, and not seeing that there's a special file type or anything like that that is in here. They all appear to have very, very, very similar styles. So the one on the left right here, in this window, is the actual full backup, that bare metal backup. And the one on the right is the one that is using the standard old Hyperbackup. And they both are building these HBK files. The files appear to be stored in very similar manners, with having just chunks of data set up. And I'm not seeing any kind of custom files in here. Obviously, I've not in-depth looked into this, so there may be something that is a limitation, but just from a cursory glance, it does not look like there's any super special sauce or anything. It would be interesting to see if you could copy this to an external hard drive and then to another Synology NAS and then restore off of that. Because if so, there would absolutely be zero limitation on why they couldn't do it to B2 or any of those other backup services, other than the fact that they actually sell you the other Synology NAS or will get a monthly recurring revenue if you use the C2 Advanced plan. So that was annoying, especially originally I assumed that there was some special sauce going on with that HBK file, but after looking into it, they look to be very, very, very similar HBK files. And I'm not seeing a true difference in how the data is stored in the HBK files between a full bare metal backup and a standard hyper backup. So I do think it may just be a, hey, we make money on this kind of thing. But that is it for me ranting on that stuff. One last thing that did come out with Hyperbackup 4.1 was a release note right here that says enhanced backup performance. And this is something that I did the super in-depth testing on, and it is absolutely true. It is not a massive shift, but it is very much a positive implication. So on first backup times, we're just going to talk about 4.1 and 4.0 right here. These are the standard hyper backups, just going to the normal HBK files that you've been doing for the longest time. That upgrade had a significant performance increase. It went from 3 hours and 16 minutes to 2 hours and 56 minutes. And so that was substantial. This was when I generated 1 million 1 megabyte random files that were the same random file over and over and over again. And that's why we have a big ol' asterisk on this full system backup, because I have learned that full system does inline data deduplication. And it's actually happening on the host system, the one that's being backed up, because there was next to no network traffic going on while it was doing this backup, even though it was going at about 200 megabytes per second from reading the volume. And so Hyperbackup 4.1 full system has some major performance increases, especially if you are having similar files. And I think either way, it still would be faster, even if it wasn't deduping these files, just because now it's actually backing up the underlying data and not necessarily having to do the full metadata. So I do think it should be faster, though unfortunately, it takes way too long to generate random data. And so I just don't have time to fully test that out. For second backup times, this was where nothing at all has changed. I just finish one backup, reboot it, hit backup again, and see how long it takes to back up. Second backup times, we also saw a marked improvement in standard Hyperbackup 4.1. 4.0 took 3 minutes and 2 seconds. 4.1 took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. So there was a real substantial improvement in Hyperbackup 4.1 standard. The full system backup did actually take a little bit longer, and that does make sense because it's actually got to back up the underlying system config and everything like that in a much more complex way than just having the versioning setup that is in the standard Hyperbackup. So it does make sense that it did take a little bit longer when absolutely nothing has changed. I was actually pretty impressed by these times overall because it had to scan 1 million files and see what has changed, which is something that is not easy to do. And you can really see that those first backup times took a very long time because of it. Finally, my third test was going in and I used another script to modify all those random files to a simple text file that was only about a sentence long and then back it up. So this is having actually 1 million file changes, but they're tiny changes. They are going to much simpler files. Hyperbackup 4.0 actually, I'll be honest with you, did pretty well for that, given it was 1 million files. It was going from a DS923 Plus to a DS1522 Plus over a local 10 gig connection, super fast. So there was very low latency, which I think was a major component to why these times were so fast. But Hyperbackup 4.0 did that in 6 minutes and 17 seconds, and Hyperbackup 4.1 did that in 5 minutes and 43 seconds. This is where we now get to where I broke everything because Hyperbackup 4.1 full system never finished. And I tried it multiple times and I think I just found out how to break this, which is slightly concerning. So when I go into NAS 1 right here, we can see that NAS 2, this one's the bare metal backup, it has yet to be able to finish since I took all those major files and changed them to the simple files. So I took the random data and I modified all 1 million of those to be a simple sentence text file. Since then, I have not been able to get this bare metal that existed on the previous one to start. And I think it likely has something to do with the fact that I took this to the extreme. I made 1 million identical files that ended up being about 900 gigabytes in size. And it then deduplicated those 900 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes. I then, in one fell swoop, modified all 1 million of those files to be a single sentence long, effectively dropping the overall space from 900 gigabytes to about 3 gigabytes, all also while the pool optimization is going on as well. So that is a major shift that is probably outside what will normally happen. And I think that is why this broke. Because when I hit backup now on this, it effectively just locks up. But when I do get back in, during portions of the backup, it actually shows our volume size as being up to 2.3 terabytes. So I'm not sure if it's building all the files or what it is doing. And so I think that inline deduplication that it's doing, and as well as the fact that I made these massive modifications to these files, has simply broken it, because it actually seems like it has to mount the volume somehow, the previous volume, to tell what's changed since then. And so it effectively just comes in and it runs for a little while, and it just simply says a exception occurred while backing up data, which is very, very, very unfortunate, because this is such a great backup to have. It'd be great to have these bare metal backups. I've not seen anybody else have these issues. Everybody I've asked online, I spent a lot of times on the forums asking people about how they're doing with the full bare metal backups, and nobody else has actually found these issues. So it's very likely that this is such an edge case that nobody apart from a tester would ever hit. But it does also show that there are edge cases, which is not something you want to happen on something like a backup, because backups should be something that you just set and pretty much forget. Standard regular Hyperbackup was able to handle this all without an issue. But that's where we got the actual full bare metal backup truly did have an issue. All right, well, that is overall for the data and the testing and the issue I've had. I've still yet to be able to get this to run. But now let's do some testing and show you how to set this thing up, because it's actually super easy. So NAS 1 is the DS923 Plus that we're going to be backing up, and NAS 2 is where we're going to be backing up to. I've installed Hyperbackup Vault on this system, and overall, really, really, really simple setup. What I want to do now is I want to go ahead and install the difficult program of Plex, because Plex is one program that is a pain to backup and restore, because Plex themselves, as far as I'm aware, don't have a backup button even. Even in Plex Media Server, they just do not have a backup button. So I'm going to go ahead and install Plex Media Server, and we're going to make like a super minor configuration or something. And we'll go ahead and just do a normal installation with it. And we're just going to go to the point where we get some settings, just because it's basically, if the settings stay, that means it all works pretty straightforward. This is actually interesting. I've not installed Plex in a while on this. They actually go through and have a very in-depth option for exactly what you need to do to make sure Plex will work. But we're just going to pop in here, and we are just going to stick on here. All right. So what I just did there is I just added movies. That's literally it. I did the most basic configuration just to test and see how this entire process works, because it will make this backup much easier to show, and show the major advantage of this is previous versions of backup simply do not have the ability to back up Plex. So if we go into my old standard backup right here, and I want to back up my Plex Media Server, I go into Applications. You can see only the supported applications are listed, and Plex is simply not one of them. That means that I cannot back up my Plex files without doing it manually in my own way, and Plex does not make it easy. But now we're going to go ahead and make a bare metal backup. So we're going to hit create, and here we've got the option for entire system backup. And it does have block level backup that is supposed to be faster, which I do believe will be true, though I took that to extreme because I gave it the same block over and over and over again, which was kind of cheating. Here we see we can only select the two possible options, either C2, which is in beta, or remote NAS device, which is not in beta. So the issue I have is it's not in beta anymore. So it is actually truly an issue now rather than, hey, we'll fix it later. By the way, when we go back into folders and packages, you can see it's been very much redesigned to, one, it puts their products first, which I guess I understand, but I do think it makes it a lot simpler because it's like, hey, boom, here's your local shared folder USB. These are like the super easy stuff to do. And then you've got the other basic options here. And now if you remember, there used to be a single version option or a multi-version option for both local shared folder and for rsync, something that I think confused a lot of people, including myself when I started out, because there's two options for both of them. They've finally hidden it behind a second menu. So we select local share folder. Now this is where you select that rather than have two in the menu. I like that a lot better. It makes it so much easier to explain and actually do because it's like local folder. Now you select it. So I do that like that a lot. But we're going to go back into our entire system and see we've only got the remote NAS device option or Synology C2. And just going to run through and do the basics here. So we're just connecting to the NAS. If you select no when it's a self-signed certificate, you can actually just put the username and password in locally. Now, one thing I did also want to mention is I saw some people asking about backing up to a worm folder. You cannot back up Hyperbackup or honestly pretty much any backup to a worm folder because that's not really what worm folders are designed. So worm folders are write once, read many. What that means is you can write files to it, and then after a period of time, like 2 hours normally, that file can no longer be modified. And so this is great for archival purposes where you want to make sure you've got records of everything and that nobody can accidentally screw up or change or anything like that. But for a backup, that simply does not work. Just because you could never update files or anything like that. The only way you would ever be able to do it is if you had an internal history and every time a file was changed, you kind of create a new file, but it also would be unable to actually like save any of the configuration files, such as, hey, this is the last time it was backed up or anything like that. You may be able to write it, but it is not an option for here. If you are looking for that immutability, basically just set up a regular share folder and then create immutable snapshots on top of that. And that will give you the immutability you're looking for while also being able to actually use it as a backup. So I created a worm folder right over here. And when we come into shared folder, you'll see it's just simply not an option because Hyperbackup does not support going to a immutable shared folder. And so this is our destination. And now I'm going to say, we'll call this Plex demo. We'll go ahead and you've got your normal options here, data compression, and pretty much that's it over here. And we can go ahead and run backup rotation. You'll see that there's no option to choose folders, apps, or anything like that, because when you're doing the bare metal backup, it's all or nothing. There's no way to exclude a specific folder. And another thing, there's no way to exclude snapshots. So if you're keeping snapshots for an entire year on this thing, you're going to have an entire year of snapshots on the other backup as well. And so now you've kind of increased your overall time that you've got to keep files. So that does make things a lot more difficult. But when you want a true bare metal backup, that's what you need. You need to make sure you can restore the NAS exactly how it was at any given time. So right here, this should hopefully go pretty quick. It's only got about 3 gigabytes in the system. We're going to see it go ahead and run on through. I'm interested to see if it ends up breaking because of that failed transfer, if there's any like metadata in there from the other bare metal backup. One other thing I did want to mention while this is going on, in the release notes, it says Support pausing the entire system backup process. This is not something I've figured out how to use, because right here, suspend is grayed out. So that does appear to be just for the first backup if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure where that is because I think the suspend has almost always been there. So I'm not sure what that is referring, but it does not appear like you can suspend it at specific times. I have seen that suspend is available at other times, but it does not look like it's a straight pause button. And so I'm not quite sure what that release note is. Anybody who's used Hyperbackup before, especially in long times, knows that sometimes you just cannot pause it. And hopefully this is reduced now. And that's what they're saying is you can now pause it more often, because there were times where, especially if you got a month-long backup because you've got really bad upload speed, it would not be fun at all because you couldn't reboot the device because Hyperbackup was running. And if you did, you'd lose all your progress. So having that suspend button as an option is going to be huge, assuming it does in fact work. And overall, it's just gone ahead and finished. And as you can see, that's pretty quick. It ran through and did that in what, 4 minutes and 30 seconds? So really not that big of a deal. So it was able to back up the entire thing in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So that is a very good benchmark for something that did in fact have 1 million files underneath. Though once again, they were the same files and is keeping those very small file sizes. All right, so now let's go ahead and do a restore test of this thing. I'll go ahead and I'm going to just completely uninstall Plex. Probably the easiest place to do this. I'm going to uninstall and delete everything. It says not recoverable, but in this case, I think it might be. And now let's just go back in and we're going to try the full-blown restore. So we're going to do an entire system restore, and it's going to kick us over to the system recovery setup. And so we've got the 3 different options. The proper way to have gotten to the screen apparently is to go into control panel, update and restore, system recovery. And now we can select restore system. And there's the 3 places that you can do a full backup from: C2 storage, active backup for business, or the one we're going to be doing, Hyperbackup Vault. Now we're going to go ahead and put the info for the server that has the Hyperbackup task and the port. So we're just logging into NAS2, which has the backup of the system. And now we get to select our options. So I've actually done 3 bare metal backups of this thing. Right here, this one's actually the one that did fail, but we're going to go ahead and use that Plex demo one and our restore time. And we've got an option here to include all network related settings. That's very useful. So if you've got like a static IP assigned to it and everything like that, it is very useful. In general, I like leaving these as disabled and setting up manually, unless it is truly, hey, I just need to deploy this exactly how it was. We'll go ahead and leave that on and see what happens. It's going to add our DNS, subnet mask, everything. And we're just going to go ahead and set this thing up. Right here, it says used/total capacity. And one thing that does look to be very valuable is the fact that it appears as though the destination and the original volume do not have to be the exact same type. So you should be able to, with this, back up as long as you've got enough space, take your 1522 plus and restore it to a 923 plus with more or less hard drives. So that should be available from this menu, I would expect. Once again, have not had the time to fully do the in-depth testing on that, but from the documentation I've read, it does not appear to have any of those limitations. And now we're just going to go ahead and start restore. It's going to wipe the existing system and restore it from the backup. And we're going to see it's a very simple system, though it does have 1 million files. So we'll see how long it takes to restore. And now we wait. I've got my stopwatch going, so I'll let y'all know how long this thing ends up taking. But it is going to go ahead and just do its thing. This does have a 10 gig setup. And one thing I am really interested to see what will happen is that NAS has the 10 gig adding card added. If you've not set up a ton of NASs with 10 gig cards, you might not realize the fact that Most of the time, if you add in a 10 gig add-in card before you've installed DSM and try to plug your Ethernet cable into that 10 gig add-in card, you will not be able to install DSM because in the process of installing DSM, it loads the drivers for the 10 gig cards, even the Synology branded ones. And so whenever you're setting these things up, you actually normally have to go in, do the very first installation in the built-in 1 gig ports, and then switch it over to the 10 gig port once the installation is fixed. Right now, the only network connectivity that 923 Plus that we're restoring has is on that 10 gig add-in card. So I'm interested to see if this ends up failing or not. Either way, it should not be too hard to fix if it did, because I would just plug into the 1 gig card, though that could drastically increase your rebuild times. While this is also going, we can see the network activity going from the NAS2 to the new system. It seems to be fluctuating a little bit. And I also do want to show that you can still restore single files from this. So we go in, this is the full guy right here, this bare metal file. Well, actually this one has 1 million files in this directory, so it may take a very long time to load. But right here, you can still grab the one-off files, and you can see these were my scripts that I used to actually make all these files. And let's see if it just absolutely chunks on the 1 million files directory, because in here, there are 100,000 folders. So that's going to be a lot. And actually that may screw up our restore time, because the disks are probably going to be really busy reading all these folders. Oh, it did actually load in pretty quick, so that was not too bad. You did see them in there. And so you do have the ability to download the files one-off through here, which is great. I did not know if that would be an option with the bare metal backups, because bare metal is bare metal. So it does support both bare metal and file level recovery, which is super, super, super useful. So if you lose one file, you don't have to restore your entire NAS, which is critical. All right, well, now our ETA is 27 minutes, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop this recording and leave this up, and we will see what it's like when this thing's done. Whew! 1 hour and 11 minutes. This was not a fast restore. It did have to go through and completely rebuild the entire pool and everything, but it was not a short restore by any means at all. I will say, from looking at the network activity and the disk utilization, it was very low throughput. So I believe that most of the time was actually spent configuring internal system configurations and things like that. So I'm imagining that if you had something like 10 terabytes or something, you would not have that much of a different thing. I would say more likely than not, 1 hour is kind of your base level, hey, just to do the super basics. And then data would be on top of that, just because right now we only have 3 gigs in this system. So it definitely took a long time, but let's go ahead and see what it did. If we open up Plex, we should be able to hopefully see that, boom, all those settings are back exactly how they were. Overall, it is like nothing ever happened. We can look through our logs, and we can pretty much see that everything followed on in, and we actually see the logs from when this explains why it failed. So it turns out that we were running out of RAM when the previous backup was going, but we can see that it pretty much recreated the entire system as a boom, just all of a sudden teleported right back in there. We can see right here, basically everything just resumed right at 10:11, which is actually 11:11 because this is off by a time zone, but it just booted up as if nothing ever happened. We still have identical network setup and everything like that. And so it truly is the bare metal restore that it promises to be. Now we have to talk about the time. The time it took was 1 hour and 11 minutes to do essentially no data. There were 1 million files in there, but to do 3 gigabytes worth of data in one application or a few applications. I think by far the biggest part of this is there is going to be a constant time that is just, this is what's required to even do it, just because it's got to slowly build the entire core system. And then data on top of that, I'm hoping, is not too much longer. I am going to, and you'll actually probably see it down right here in a little box at the bottom below, I'm going to go ahead and do a restore and time that for how long it takes to do that 900 gig version with all those files. And so that is going to be kind of the other option of this system is, hey, what if you actually do have a lot of data? I'm hoping that that will be under 2 hours. And if so, that gives me very good hope for this all working well. I would say by far the most important thing for this is Hyperbackup is your true disaster recovery. It is designed to have the entire office burned down or somebody break in and steal everything and be able to get back up and running. So with that disaster recovery, the way I see it is you want to make sure that if that disaster occurs, you want to be able to get back up and running within a business day. Obviously, you'd want it to be as little as possible, but in the case we're actually having to completely rebuild a NAS, that is 1 business day in my mind. So for it to be kind of acceptable, I would want it to be done within 16 hours. That would ensure that if you're working on it at the end of a business day and it happens, over the course of the evening, you can get it back up and running. And that's only applicable for disaster recovery, right? Because I would say 99.9% of businesses should hopefully never have to do this restore. However, maybe 5% of them do in fact have to do a failover from their main NAS to their secondary NAS. So it's one of those things where you want to make sure you've got that true disaster recovery. And if disaster actually strikes, where both your on-site NASs of a 3-2-1 backup solution are irrecoverable for whatever reason, to me, in my mind, 1 business day is an acceptable amount of time. So I'll go ahead and leave that time down below. It's going to be up to you for what you think is acceptable for you and your business. So at the end of the day, one good thing is during that time while it was restoring, I was able to download files from the backup NAS one-offs. So you're not completely out of luck. If you really had to, you would be able to download files one-off and be able to restore those like that. All right, so really quick interjection from Will right here, just from the future. I did want to give a quick update. It has been 8 minutes and 24 seconds, and the estimated finish time is 1 hour and 42 minutes from now. So this does look like it's just going to barely get underneath that kind of 2-hour arbitrary number I picked for a good restore. When originally this time was actually dead accurate for the other restore, so I would trust it decently well. To me, this is looking like we may be able to restore ballpark roughly 1 terabyte per hour. Just ballpark. Hopefully it does get faster with like a 10 terabyte one, but at least that is at least somewhat usable where you probably could restore most Office file servers within that kind of overnight 16-hour period from when work ends to work begins. We should be able to restore hopefully most ones. I really do wish this number was down, but as disaster recovery, I think right now it is just teetering at the acceptable level, because if you have gone to your disaster recovery backup, you are just going to be happy that this thing restores and restores completely. All right, well now back to the rest of this video, and at the end we'll also get an update on how long it actually took. Overall, I think Hyperbackup 4.1 does its job pretty well. I do think that I probably broke it by creating a condition that's not likely to happen outside of testing, but it does show that there are true issues and that it is possibly broken with what I would call regular file operations. Not doing anything too much behind the scenes or anything, really just a specific way you may use your files may break this, at least this version. Hopefully this is something that they can fix, but I would say it's probably unlikely to happen to you, though it being there is always a worry. I'm gonna go ahead and do that restore now with that 900 gig file, and we'll go ahead and see how it goes. Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to leave those down in the description below, and have a good one. Bye.